Welcome to this Wise-Owl Excel VBA tutorial. In this video, we'll cover the basics of sending HTTP GET and POST requests. We'll start with a quick look at how you retrieve data from a web page with a basic GET request and show you a few sample procedures for parsing the HTML response. We'll explain how you can use the basic Chrome developer tools so you can understand how your web browser requests content from a web page. And then we'll look at how you can pass data into a GET request with simple query string parameters. We'll briefly talk about how you use %encoding with parameter values and show you an Excel worksheet function you can use to take away the hard work of performing that task. We'll then look at how you can send data in the body of a basic POST request. We'll talk quickly about how you can set request headers and then look at a couple of examples for returning information from your POST requests. So quite a lot to do here. Let's get started. Let's start by opening up the file that I've created for this video. I'll stick a link so that you can download this in the video description below. And when you've got hold of a copy, just give it a double click to open it up. You might need to hit the Enable Content button to allow any existing code to run. And when you've done that, head into the Visual Basic Editor and you'll see there's a couple of items that exist in here already. There's a basic user form and there's a basic module with some code in there for parsing some HTML. But we're not going to look at those items just yet. What we'll do is insert a new module and we'll change its name as well. Let's rename this one so it's called something like mRequests. And then what we'll do is start by creating a new subroutine called basic get request, which is the very first thing we're going to create. Before we start writing any code, it's worthwhile having a quick check that you've got some references to some extra object libraries. If we head to the Tools menu and choose References, you should find that in this particular project, we've got references to the Microsoft XML library, in my case the version 6, and then also the Microsoft HTML object library. So you should also have those checked if you've downloaded and opened up the same sample file as I'm showing you here. Before we start writing the code, I'd like to use a web browser to take a quick look at the web page that our GET request is going to retrieve. I'll use Google Chrome for this, and the website I'm going to use to demonstrate is the Wise-Owl website, which is something hopefully you're fairly familiar with already. Specifically in this website, I'd like to look at the resources section and then the videos category. And then in the videos category, I'd like to look at the Visual Basic for Applications category. And then finally, the VBA scraping websites section, which seems appropriate for what we're doing here. Now I'd like to use the Chrome developer tools to find out a little more information about how we ended up on this page. I can open the developer tools by pressing the F12 key, and when that window opens, you may be fairly familiar with this view if you've watched any of the previous videos in this series. We've used the Elements page of the DevTools window to analyze the individual HTML elements on a page when we've been trying to scrape web pages and parse the HTML. So we've done things like right-clicked on an element in a page and then chosen the Inspect option, and it gives us information about that specific HTML tag. What I'm interested in right now is the Network page, so I'm going to click on the Network tool in the menu. And then I want to see how this page was loaded. So because I've opened up the network page after the page had loaded, I need to reload it to make anything happen here. So I can press Ctrl and R on the keyboard. And what I should see now is a list of basically actions that have taken place to make this page appear in my browser. The main thing that I'm interested in here is the URL that we requested, the VBA-scrape-websites. So if I click on that item, I get more information about that specific item and how it was loaded. So you can see here that we've requested a specific URL, which isn't a great surprise. We clicked on a link to visit it anyway. The method we used to reach this URL was the get method. And then it returned a status code of 200, which indicates everything's okay. And then there's various other bits of information here as well, which aren't important right now, but will become more important as we progress through this video. At this point, really, this is just background information and provides us with sort of a baseline for a simple GET request so that we can see how more complex requests differ when we come back to visit these tools later on. For now, let's return to the Visual Basic Editor and let's put this into VBA speak by sending a GET request to return that exact same page. Let's declare a couple of simple variables to help with this. I'm going to call the first one req or rec as a new msxml2.xml http60. So that's the object that allows us to open and send a request and receive some kind of response. I'd like to hold the URL that I'm going to request in a separate variable, so let's call this rec URL as a string. And then I'm going to set the value of the rec URL variable to be equal to the URL of the web page we were just looking at. So let's just quickly cheat and go back to the web browser and copy and paste the URL that I was just looking at. Okay, the next thing I need to do is open up my request. So I can say rec.open, and there are several things I need to specify here. First of all, the method that I want to use. We saw in the dev tools that the method we used to retrieve that page was a get method. So we can say get as a string in double quotes. The URL that we're going to go for is the one that I've just stored in my rec URL variable. And then just to make sure that the code doesn't continue immediately after opening the request, making sure it waits for a complete response, we'll set the third parameter var async to false. We then need to send the request. So I'm going to say rec.send. And then we should check the status of the response. So we saw that when everything was okay, we got a response status of 200. We'll say if rec.status is not equal to 200, then that indicates that things might not be okay. So we'll show a simple message box. I'll spell that correctly as well, message box. And then the prompt will be rec.status, so we can see the number of the status, and then concatenate that with a symbol hyphen, and then concatenate that with the rec.status text, so we get some more information about what might have potentially gone wrong. I'll then exit the sub and end the if statement. And then just to see some kind of basic response for now, what I'd like to do is debug.print the response text. So I can say debug.print rec.response text. Let's make sure that we can actually see the immediate window. Then if I head to the view menu and choose immediate window, or press Ctrl and G on the keyboard, I can then return to my subroutine and choose to run it. And hopefully I ought to end up with some kind of response text in the immediate window. Not all of it will make absolute sense at this point, it's not really intended to, but just to prove that we are receiving some kind of response from our simple GET request. So there we go, we can see some information in there. Now, of course, writing out the response text to the immediate window isn't particularly helpful in the long run in the real world. You'd want to do something with the response text to extract some useful information from it. So this is what the parse HTML module is for. I've written several different routines in here to parse the HTML of various pages that we're going to request information from. If I just quickly open up that module, first of all, there's a parse YSAL videos subroutine into which we can pass an HTML string. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm just going to call on this one. If you're interested, basically because we've spent so much time in previous videos looking at how to parse HTML by looping through various elements and getting references to various elements, I didn't want to spend too much time in this video going over old ground. But you're welcome to take a look at this code, have a quick look at how it works. You'll recognize a lot of the stuff in here from previous videos if you've watched any of the other videos in the series. It's just standard stuff to get references to various elements using either tag names or class names, looping through them, and then writing out the content of those into cells in a worksheet. So just to demonstrate how this one quickly works, I'm going to call parse YSAL videos and pass in the HTML string. If I head back to my module called requests, rather than just debug.printing this, I can say parse YSAL videos and then pass in rec.response text to that one. If I now run this subroutine again, I ought to end up with a new worksheet in my workbook. And then when it's finally finished processing that page, we ought to have ended up with, and it's still going, I think, but if I switch back to Excel once it's finished, there we go, some nice, simple, basic information about the videos that were listed out on that page that we requested. Now, because I didn't want to have to write a separate parsing routine for absolutely every page we're going to visit in this video, I'm going to spend a tiny little bit of time writing a simple routine that will save the HTML results as an HTML document. So what we're going to do is head back into the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to add a new subroutine at the top of this module. I'll call it sub save HTML file. And what I wanted to be able to do is pass in the HTML string, so our response text, as a string, which will then save into a separate text file. So I'm going to call this this parameter HTML string as string. And I'll close the parentheses to make that syntax valid. To make my life easier, I'm going to set a reference to the Microsoft Scripting Runtime Object Library. So if I head to the Tools menu and choose References, and then from the list I can scroll down and find Microsoft Scripting Runtime. When I've found that library, I can check the box next to it and then click OK to set that reference. If you're not sure about how this works, we do have videos that explain exactly how to use the file system object library, also the scripting runtime object library, working with file system objects and creating text files. So feel free to reference those later on if you need them. For now, what we'll do is declare a couple of simple variables, dim fso as new scripting.filesystemObject, and then dim ts as scripting.textstream. We can then set ts to be equal to fso dot and then create text file. If I open some parentheses, there are 3 parameters I can fill in. So the file name that I'd like to construct, I want this file to appear on my desktop. So I'm going to use the environ function to return a reference to my user profile path, first of all. And then I can concatenate to the end of that, \desktop, let's call it request output, and then make this an HTML document by tagging on the .htm extension. Now, if I already have that file created, I'd like the new one to overwrite it. So I'll set the overwrite parameter to true. And then finally, I want to make sure that it's a Unicode encoded text file as well. So I'll set the Unicode parameter to true as well. So when I create the text file and overwrite it, if it's already there, it will be available for me to write information to it. So I can do that by saying ts.write. What I'd like to do is write in the entire HTML string into the text file. Finally, I'll say ts.close, and then I can give this one a quick simple test by replacing the parse wisal videos with response text by saying save HTML file, and then I can pass in rec.response text. This isn't necessarily a great idea in the real world, but for this video it's a nice convenient way to show you the output using a simple text file. So having run this subroutine again, I can switch back to my desktop now. There's my basic request output file. If I give this a quick double click, it will open up in my default web browser, and it will simply show me, if I scroll down far enough, whether I've returned the correct page, basically. So although the content isn't formatted in the right way, at least I can see that it matches the information contained in the page that we were analyzing earlier on. So that file will simply be replaced each time we run the subroutine and call that method. And it's a nice handy way for me to demonstrate the results of our various requests. So that's a fairly simple example of a GET request. Now let's do something a little more interesting. Let's have a look at how we can send some data along with a GET request. For this example, I'm going to switch to the YouTube website, and I'm going to perform a quick search using the search box at the top of the page. If I click into the search box, I'm going to search for wisal tutorials, which I've clearly already done a couple of times recently very egocentric of me, but anyway, if I wanted to search for this again rather than type it in, I can just click on wisal tutorials in the list, and then I immediately get a set of results returned to me. You should be able to make out in the URL at the top of the screen there that the URL that I've used to present this page includes the information that I passed in. So at the end of the URL, following a question mark, I've got search query equals wisal tutorials, and that's clearly exactly what I've either typed in or selected from my search box. Again, you can see this information in the Chrome Developer Tools. If I press F12 to load the Developer Tools and then hit Ctrl-R to reload the page so I can see the activity recorded for me. If I then, well, lots of things happen when you load a page on YouTube. If I scroll up to the top of the page, I can see my results URL. So if I click on that, I can see again the same information. I've got request URL, which is of course the URL that's presented up here, the method used, which is get, the status code 200, so everything's okay. And if I scroll down, I should find at the bottom of this panel a little section for query string parameters. So that part at the end of the URL following the question mark is referred to as the query string. So that query string includes one single parameter called search query, and the value I've passed into it is YSL tutorials. So if I have a quick look at how I can duplicate that in VBA code, it's incredibly simple. Let's switch back to the Visual Basic Editor and then save a bit of time by copying and pasting the basic get request subroutine. Let's change its name, so it's called basic get request with query string. And then all we need to do then is head back to the web browser and save a bit of time by copying and pasting that URL. And then I can paste it into my VBA code there in place of the YSL URL. Importantly, it's including the query string, so the question mark search query equals YSL tutorials. Now, although it's already commented out, there would absolutely be no point in ever calling the parse YSL videos procedure. So let's just delete that line entirely so we don't get tempted to uncomment it and find that it doesn't work. And then if we simply run this subroutine, and when it's finished, we can switch back to the desktop and open up the request output HTML file, and we should find that what we've got is a set of results from that search. So all the information from the YSL tutorial search. Now, in this first simple example of a query string, you may have noticed that the phrase we typed into the search box was shown exactly as we typed it in the URL. But this won't always be the case. If I typed in YSL tutorials with spaces separating the separate words, when I search for this, you should see that in the URL, the spaces get replaced with plus symbols. You'll notice similar effects when you type in certain special characters. So, for example, if I search for dogs and cats but used an ampersand instead of the word and, you'll see that in the URL, the spaces again get replaced with pluses, and the ampersand gets replaced with %26. The reason this happens in the first place is because URL strings are percent encoded. You can get an idea as to what that means with a quick search. There's a nice article on Wikipedia about percent encoding. There it is. And you'll see that certain special characters are reserved characters, so they have a special meaning in a URL. And that means that you can't just type them directly into a URL, because their meaning would be confused. So they need to be encoded with some kind of percent character. So for example, an exclamation mark is %21, an ampersand, as we've just seen, is %26, and so on. Now, the first thing you need to ask is, does this actually matter? Things like spaces, do we need to replace spaces with plus symbols in our VBA code? And the short answer to that is actually technically not. There's a little section here that describes the fact that after the question mark character in the query part of the URL, if the reserved character doesn't have a special meaning, you don't technically need to percent encode it. So, for example, if I change my search phrase here to YSL tutorials, and then let me just quickly switch back and close down the page I have open. If I run my subroutine again to generate a new output file and then open that request output file up, I will see once again that I return all of the information about YSL tutorials. So encoding spaces with plus symbols isn't actually required. If it makes you feel better, you can certainly do it that way. I can put plus symbols in instead of spaces. And if I again close down the file and then run the subroutine again, and then when that's happened, I can open up the request output file. Eventually, there we go. And I'll see once again I get exactly the same results for YSL tutorials. There are occasions, however, where percent encoding does make sense. Let's say, for example, I was trying to search for C++ tutorials, for example. Maybe I got bored of VBA and I want to give myself more of a challenge and learn a more advanced programming language. Let's say I want to change my search query to search for C++. You can probably predict the sort of thing that might happen here. If I run this subroutine, it does indeed work, and it sends this search query C++ to the get request. If I, however, open up my request output file, if I expect to see videos on C++, I'm going to be slightly disappointed. This clearly doesn't look to me like a set of tutorials on how to learn how to program in a more advanced programming language. So if I wanted this one to work properly, what I should do, let's just close this one down. You can hopefully see here that in the little title bar here of the tab that it's searching for C, not C++. Let's close that down. Let's look at replacing the plus symbols with their correct percent encoded values. That's %2b. So if I switch back to my Visual Basic Editor, rather than searching for C++, I could search for C, %2b, %2b. So I need 2 copies of that, 1 for each plus symbol. Now if I run the subroutine again this time, and I browse back to my desktop and open up my request output file, this time what I should see is indeed I do find C++ tutorials, which is exactly what I wanted. Actually, no, I don't. I don't want to learn C++ right now. I need to focus on VBA for the moment. But there's a reason why percent encoding is important. Now, if you're thinking that manually replacing every special character with the percent encoded version is a tedious, laborious task, I absolutely agree with you. But fortunately, Microsoft have thought of that, and in Excel, they've provided you with a worksheet function that will encode strings with percent encoding. So just very quickly, I can open up the immediate window. And if, for example, I typed in question mark and looked for the worksheet function property, and then in there looked for the encode URL function. Ah, perfect. So I can pass in any string here. Let's just pass in the C++ string that we've just searched for. And then if I hit enter, I'll return the percent encoded version of that. So wonderfully, you don't have to do all this manual encoding. You can use this function to do that for you. So the way that would work is you would do something like this. You would concatenate your URL, starting with the beginning part and the name of the parameter and the equals operator, and then concatenate that with worksheet function dot encode URL, open up some parentheses, and then pass in the search phrase you were looking for. So you could type that in as you'd expect. So I could go for C++ tutorial this time. So percent encoded, that would be C %2b plus tutorial. And in fact, let's just check that that's the case. If I pass that in here and then hit enter, that's in fact, the space gets replaced with a %20 rather than a plus symbol. Okay, so let's run that subroutine again. And then if we have a quick look at the results of that one, if I switch back to my desktop, open up my request output file, and then just check that once again, I end up with C++ tutorial videos. The encode URL function is especially useful when you're asking users to provide input for your GET requests. Let's just close down this page again and then switch back to the Visual Basic Editor. Let's just alter this, this routine again to allow the user to search for some YouTube videos. Let's have a new variable. Let's say dim search text as string. And then what I can do is ask the user to provide a search string by typing into an input box. So I can say search text equals input box, and then in some parentheses and double quotes, ask the user to search YouTube for, and then they can type in whatever they like, and that value will then be returned to the search text variable. Now, of course, what I'd like to do is concatenate that into my request URL, but I don't want to just pass in the exact value the user is typed in. I want to encode the URL, so I can say worksheet function.encode URL search text. So now the user can safely type in whatever they like into the search text input box and return some valid results. Let's just make sure the user doesn't attempt to search for an empty string. We should have a quick little if statement. If search text equals an empty string, then we can simply exit the subroutine. So that will also handle what happens if the user just clicks cancel on the input box. So having done that, let's run the subroutine again, and then let's search YouTube for, oh gosh, I don't know, let's search for dogs and cats using an ampersand, and then hit enter. And then when the subroutine is finished running, we can switch back to the desktop and then double click the request output file. And once again, we should see we get dogs and cats videos searched for. So that's a simple query string involving one single parameter. But what about when you have multiple parameters to pass values to? For example, on the Bank of England exchange rates database, I can provide values to 5 different query string parameters here using the drop-down lists at the top of the table. So I can specify a date, I can choose a currency, and then choose a particular view from one of 3. And each of these values is passed into one of 5 different query string parameters in the URL. So you should be able to make out here, after the question mark, I've got td equals 3, and then separating the first parameter from the next is an ampersand character. So ampersand tm equals June, then another ampersand ty equals 2019, then an into parameter and a rate view parameter. So if I wanted to pass values to multiple parameters, it's simply a case of concatenating them all together in the URL. The awkward thing is, what if you need to URL encode or percent encode each of the values you're passing in? That's quite a lot of concatenation to make this work, but let's just have a quick demonstration of how that works. If I switch back to the Visual Basic Editor, let's start by copying and pasting the basic GET request, and then we can paste that subroutine down a little further down. And then we can change the name of this one, so it's basic GET request with multiple query string parameters. Okay, at that point then we can just go away and copy and paste the URL from the Bank of England exchange rates database. Let's copy that and then paste it into the new subroutine. And then what we'd need to do is start splitting this URL string into its various component parts. So to make life easier here, I'm going to separate it onto multiple different lines using a space underscore continuation character. Now, the very beginning of my URL string up to the first parameter and the equals operator should be enclosed in a single set of double quotes. And then I can concatenate that with the next part, but using a space underscore to break this onto a new line. Now, numeric values, numbers, don't need to be percent encoded, so you'll just have to pretend for the sake of demonstration that the value passed into this particular URL could be something that isn't a number. So at this point, I would say worksheet function dot encode URL, open some parentheses, and then enclose the number 3 in some double quotes and close the round brackets, and then concatenate that with the next part of the query string. So that would be everything up to ampersand tm equals, and then you probably get the idea from this point. So I can separate that onto a new line, and then let's just copy and paste a little bit at least. So I can say worksheet function encode June, and then concatenate that with the next parameter name, which is ampersand ty equals, and so on and so on and so on. Excuse me, I've just missed off an ampersand at the end of the previous line there. Mustn't forget that, otherwise the whole thing will fall over. Okay, I can paste in worksheet function encode URL again, encode 2019, and not too far to go now, so encode the into parameter and another ampersand and another underscore, paste in the function name again, nearly there, one more to go, break this onto the next line, excuse me, break this onto the next line, and the very last thing we need is to encode the letter D, which will just come out as a letter D anyway. So this was quite a lot of unnecessary work, as it turns out, because none of the values here actually needed to be percent encoded. But if you encounter a website where the values you're passing into multiple parameters do need to be percent encoded, it's something as annoying as this, encoding each individual value before concatenating them with their relevant parameter name. Anyway, having done that, let's just have a quick go at running this subroutine to get a simple text output. And if we do that and then navigate back to the desktop and we open up the request URL, so there we go, we can clearly see we're now getting Bank of England exchange rates. And I do actually have a parser routine that will spit out some sensible results into an Excel worksheet. So let's just get rid of the parse WYSAL videos line and then have a look at using the parse BOE exchange rates routine. We pass in the response text. Let's just comment out the save HTML file. And then if we run this subroutine now, and then have a quick look at the output in Excel, there we go, we've got all the results outputted into a nice, basically formatted, but easy to read Excel table. In terms of user input, you probably wouldn't want to have to display 5 separate input boxes and rely on your end users to type in a valid value into each one. This is a great case for designing a user form. And if I switch back to the Visual Basic Editor and have a look in the Forms folder, there's my BOE exchange rates form. If I double click to open that up, you can have a look at the code sitting behind this actually. If you right click on the form and choose to view its code, here's all the code. So there's nothing massively complicated in here. The main routine, the one that says get rates click, just constructs the query string. It's mostly constructed of if statements to check that people have picked valid values. I haven't even bothered using the encode URL function for this, but we could in the query string line here where we're concatenating the query string part, you could encode the individual values for each of the drop-down lists on the form. The initialize routine just populates all the drop-down lists and sets some default values. And then when the query string has been constructed, it gets passed to the get Bank of England exchange rates routine, which is sitting in the form as well. So this one is essentially the same as the one we've just constructed ourselves. It's just that it has a parameter allowing us to pass the query string into. So it constructs that and then returns a set of results. So if you wanted to see this one working, you could double click on the form and then run it by pressing F5 or clicking the run sub button, and then you can enter some valid values into the query details using the drop down lists. There should be enough validation to make it difficult to pick invalid values. And then if I did just quickly click the get rates button, it does generate the query string and shows you what's been constructed, and then it should output a set of results for you as well on a new worksheet. So yeah, let's just go with a different option so we can see something interesting happen. Let's go for GBP all available and click get rates again. And this time we'll end up with a new worksheet with a new set of values entered into it. Okay, so there you go, a nice user form there. So thinking about user interfaces, a user form is a wonderful way to construct your query strings. If you are interested in building these sorts of forms, by the way, we do have a full playlist which explains exactly how to do it. Everything from drawing the form in the first place through adding all the fancy controls and adding all the code to it to make it actually work. So yeah, well worth a quick watch if you're interested at all in building these sorts of things. Maybe just for a basic example for this one, we should create a better way to launch the form rather than having to go into the Visual Basic Editor. So let's just insert another basic module and let's call it M user forms, and then in here we can create a quick subroutine called display rates form. Sorry, that was meant to be rate form rather than rate fours. Display rate form, and then all we need to do is refer to the name of the form as its class BOE exchange rates dot show. So a nice simple basic way of making this work. What we could then do is switch back into the Excel workbook and maybe head on to sheet 1, draw a really simple button from the Developer tab, head to the Insert tool, find the Form Control section and draw a really simple basic button, make it nice and large so we can see it. And then I can simply attach my display rate form routine to that. I can then just edit the text on the button nice and quickly, show rate form, and then when I click away from the button, it's now live and I can click on it to make my form appear. So just to wrap up that little section about user forms. So there's a couple of examples of using the get method to send information in a request and return different results based on the values passed. But what if get isn't the method that's being used? What if post is the method? First of all, how could you find out if post was the method being used to send information? Well, we've already seen one technique actually, using the Chrome developer tools. If I switch back to Chrome and go to the Bank of England exchange rates site again, if I hit the F12 key to launch the developer tools, We saw one way, if I reload the page by pressing Ctrl and R, we saw that if we selected an item in this list, here we go, I can see that it's used the get method to request the information, and if I scroll down far enough, I'd find the query string parameters section showing me the names of the query string parameters and then the values passed into them. Another way you could have attempted to find out whether a GET request was being used was to inspect an element in the form. So for example, if I right-clicked on the drop-down list for day of the month and chose to inspect it, the developer tools will take me to the item that has that value or accepts that value. I'll find if I go up through the nodes, just go up through the tree, I'll eventually reach something called a form tag. So I can see here that I've got a form tag which requests a rates table using the get method. So there's another clue that the get method is being used for this particular form when it's submitted. Let's compare that with the Wise Owl website and see how the search form works on there. If I switch into the Wise Owl page, and again you could just navigate to this or search for this using Google, of course. If I have a quick right click on my search here box and then choose inspect, I'll find again that this is part of a form, and there it is. It's got an action when it's submitted to go to search start, and then the method used here is post. And if we were to have a quick look at what happens if I search for something in the Wise Owl page, let's search for Excel VBA. Why not? That seems like a sensible thing to search for. If I click go and then have a look on the network page and scroll up to the top, find my start option. So I can see here that the request method being used here is post. So it's got a request URL using post. There are definitely no query string parameters in the URL. There's no question mark, a query parameter name or a value passed into it. If I scroll down towards the bottom, what I can see is that the query string parameters section has been replaced with a form data section. So I've got a named field called what, and the value passed into that is Excel VBA. Now, if you're interested in the technical differences between how the get and the post methods work, there are plenty of websites that will describe this for you in hideous amounts of detail. Wikipedia is a nice place to start if you search for something like HTTP request, and then have a quick look at the response page. You can have a quick look here. There's a whole section about the various different methods or the request methods for HTTP requests, and then there's a further discussion about how they all work and how they differ. For a slightly simpler comparison, W3 Schools is a nice example. So W3 Schools get and post. And there's a nice little article here about get versus post. So there's a nice table somewhere down here towards the bottom of the page that compare the get and the post methods. So you can have a quick read of that if you're interested in the technical details. What I really care about in this particular video is how you write the VBA code to generate a post request rather than a get request. So let's switch back to the Visual Basic editor, and then let's just close down the form and close down that extra module to get back to our main module. We'll get there eventually. Let's close down the form code as well. Close down the parse HTML. I should have just double clicked on my requests page. There we go. So what I'm going to do is scroll back up towards the top here, and then let's copy our basic get request routine again, and then we can scroll down to the bottom of the module, paste that in, then change the name of it to basic post request, and then look at the changes we need to make to get this to work. The first thing we should do then is get the correct URL, so we can get that again back from the Chrome developer tools. Let's switch back to Chrome and then head back to the Wise Owl page, and then we can simply scroll up and find the requested URL. So we can just grab that string, copy it, and then drop that back into our VBA code. So that's nice and simple. Hopefully the obvious next thing we need to change is the method we're using. So we're not using a get method anymore, of course. We're clearly using a post method. Get is simply not accessible to this form. So let's say post rather than get. The request URL is the same, and we want to set the async to false still, so those don't change. We can send the request then, but when we send the request, what we'll also need to do is state what body we want to send with the request. So rather than passing the values in the query string in the URL itself, The values we're passing in this time go in the body of the request, so that gets passed in via the send method. So the values we need to pass in, if we have a quick look back at the developer tools again, Chrome developer tools, scroll down, we can see that the what, so what is the name of the value or the field, and then the value we're passing in is XLVBA. You can switch between the normal view and the URL encoded view, so you can see that it's passed in with XL plus VBA, and then the source will also show you how that has been constructed. So when the search form was entered or submitted, it showed us that this was what equals XL plus VBA. So that's essentially what we want to see. When it's all parsed to make it make sense in plain English and decoded, it looks like this to human beings. But the source is really what we're interested in. So what equals XL plus VBA. So let's just make sure that we pass that in there as well. So what equals XL plus VBA. Now there's one other thing we need to do, which isn't immediately obvious, but in order to get the right results, let's just have a look at what happens when we send this request without the extra need to parse. If I run this subroutine at this point and get a new HTML file and then have a look back at the desktop, open up the request output and have a look at the results, we get 6 results apparently for XLVBA, which seems a little low when the web page that the search we performed manually found over 200 results. So something clearly isn't quite right here. And basically what's happening here is we're not sending, or we're not informing the post request that we're sending URL encoded content. In order to make that work, what we have to do is set one of the request headers to tell it which type of content we're sending. So you might be able to make out again in the developer tools that there's a request headers section, and one of those request headers says content type. Specifically for URL encoded content, we need to set it to application /x www.form URL encoded. If you are interested in other potential content types, then again, you could perhaps, if I just close down that file, you could use Wikipedia to find this. There's if you search for MIME types or something like that, MIME type, then you'll find a list of common examples for MIME types, of which the one we're about to use is one. So there's a bit of history there about what these are. So anyway, to make this work in VBA, which is really what we're interested in here, rather than the history of HTTP, in between opening the request and sending it, we need to set a request header. So we can say rec.setRequestHeader. And then the name of the header we need to set is content type. So content dash type. And again, we could have just copied this from the developer tools. And then the value of the content type, in fact, let's copy this from the developer tools to make sure we don't mistype it. The actual content type will be application yada yada yada. So let's just copy that and then paste that in to our code. Okay, so if we run this one this time and have a look at the output, if I switch back to the desktop, we should see that this time we get way more than just 6 results. We do indeed get over 200, just like we saw when we manually performed that search on the Wiseowl website. Again, just to demonstrate what you can do with the response text rather than just saving it as an HTML file, I've got another parsing routine called parse Wiseowl search results. There we go. And this processes the search results to write out the URLs of the content that we found. So should I want to call this one back in my requests module, I can comment out the save HTML file and then uncomment the parse Wiseowl videos section, and then let's just change that so it's not parse Wiseowl videos, it's parse Wiseowl search results. So with XLVBA as our what, we can run that subroutine and we ought to end up with a new worksheet. And if I quickly switch back and look at the results in Excel, I should see a list of the various types of content, including the little images we saw on the web page there as well. So I've managed to grab hold of those. So one column for each set of content with links to each. So feel free to play around with this. You might want to create a user form perhaps, or a simple input box. You could use the encode URL function again, which is probably a good idea in fact, isn't it? We should really be concatenating this and using the worksheet function dot encode URL, and then passing in our string as plain English text with spaces and any other characters we want, and making sure the function performs the encoding for us to make sure we don't get it wrong. We could search for web scraping instead this time, so let's go for web scraping, see what we can return on that, and then we've run the subroutine again. We'll get another worksheet with a list of web scraping things, just blogs and tutorials this time, no training courses or newsletters or other types of content. So again, you can feel free to play around with this to get the user input in the form you want, but the request itself isn't massively different from a GET request. The important things are setting the request header to make sure you're setting the correct content type, and then making sure that you pass the values and then names in the send method rather than in the URL itself. You can also pass multiple values in the body of a post request in much the same way as you pass multiple values in a query string for a GET request. The WiseR website isn't a great example of that, of course, because it only has one field to pass a value into. There's a what field in the form. Let's have a look for another website that allows you to post multiple values. If we have a quick look for IMDb Advanced Search, there's a wonderful advanced search form on the IMDb website with many values available to be filled in. If we just start by right-clicking on the title text box and choose to inspect that, we can see that that title input is part of a form which does indeed use the post method and has an action of /search/title when it's submitted. Okay, so to make that work, what we could do is go back to the Visual Basic Editor. Let's create a copy of our basic post request subroutine and then paste that in. And then let's change the name of this one so it's basic post request, multiple values. This isn't particularly complicated, but it's worthwhile just very quickly going through an example. So if I go back to the Chrome tools, and then I can find the URL. Actually, I'll copy the URL from the address bar. That's the simplest thing to do. And then I can paste that into the request URL variable. It's a post request, of course. It's going to be form URL encoded. And then it's simply a case now of building up our simple request body. In fact, let's declare a separate variable for this. Let's say dim rec body as string. And then we can begin constructing our request body by saying rec body equals, and then start writing out the various parameter names. A simple way to find out what these parameter names are, or these field names are, is to head back to the web page and actually perform a search. So let's head back to Chrome and then let's type in a quick title, a nice simple one. Let's go for John Wick. And then we could maybe let's fill in the release date as well. Let's go for anything released since, the start of, let's go for 2018. So we fill it in 2018-01-01. And then we could also choose that the genres was action. That should be sufficient. So having done that, we can perform the search by clicking the search button down at the bottom or just pressing enter, and that will submit the post request and return a set of results. Okay, so we can find out what how those results were passed in, again from the network page. Lots of things have happened. If we scroll right up to the top, the initial request, the post request, it's a slightly weird way this works. You might actually be able to make out in the URL of the page we've landed on that we've actually constructed a query string, even though this was a post request. So a slightly odd way that IMDb works. Although we sent a post request originally, the status code returned for that was 302. Now, if you're not sure what these status codes are, there's a wonderful list on Wikipedia, of course, and you'll find that 302 is found. But this tells the client to look at or browse to another URL, so it's almost like a redirect, so essentially what happens here is that when the post request has been sent, the result is redirected to another request, which is a GET request using a query string. So technically we could have used either type, either a GET request with a query string or a POST request with form values passed into the body. But as we're looking at POST requests here, let's continue by looking at the results of the POST request. So we can scroll down to the bottom of the window on the right hand side, see all the form data, an awful lot of parameters to fill in, or fields to fill in, as you might expect. So let's see, which ones do we actually care about? Well, the first three, of course, and then one a bit further down called genres. So let's see, if we viewed the source of this, we might be able to make out, it might actually be easier just to copy and paste this part. So this gives us the URL encoded version. So let's just in fact copy and paste everything up to the first genre. So genres equals action, and then we can just remove the remaining parts. You could of course just copy the entire form data string and pass all that in, although that does seem a little excessive. So let's copy that to start with, and then head back to the Visual Basic editor, and then in a set of double quotes paste in what we have just copied. So you can see again that just as with a query string, you use an ampersand to separate one field or one parameter from the next. So after we've gotten to the release date, the min release date, so we've got release date min, then after that I don't pass in anything until, let's just use the shift key and the right arrow key to continue until I get to the genres field. So there we go. Let's just get rid of all the intermediate parts. All right, so now we can send in our request body rather than our previous string, we can send rec body. Again, if you wanted to concatenate this, so you could design your own user form or use input boxes to allow the user to perform a search on IMDb and then use the encode URL function to encode the user's input, you're more than welcome to have a go at doing that. It's not really necessary at this point, as you've already seen the technique. But let's just have a quick look at what results we can get. We certainly don't want to parse the YSL search results. That would be fairly pointless. Let's just save the HTML file. If you wanted to create a parser for the IMDb results, please feel free, maybe treat that as an exercise after the video. Anyway, if I run that subroutine now, we will end up with a new output file. If I navigate back to the desktop, double click the request output, and I should see, if I scroll down far enough, once it's opened, I'll try that again. Failed to double click, there we go. So this time if I scroll down, I'll find information matching John Wick, released at least 2018-01-01. So there we go, those same three results we've just seen. Okay, well that just about covers the basic differences between using GET and POST requests in VBA. Of course, there's plenty more further reading to be done if you want to investigate this topic in a bit more depth. You can imagine it's quite a large topic. But at this point, you should have at least the basic skills required to work out which method to use when querying a website, and then how to send information in either the query string or the request body. I'm sure you'll find lots of websites where you can employ both these techniques. So have fun with that, and thanks for watching. See you next time.